The purpose of this video is just to make a basic introduction to the process of respiration. The first thing to talk about when discussing this process is the formula. Now, as we've talked about in class, this formula is basically just the reverse of what we were talking about last chapter with photosynthesis. If you remember before, our products were oxygen and glucose. Well, now those things are the reactants. Those are the things on the left-hand side of the equation. The products on the right-hand side are carbon dioxide, water, and energy. Now, technically, this energy is ATP. So even though it says energy down there at the bottom, you should know that that's the energy that's being created during this process. Now, when it comes to the products on the right, two of these things are actually waste products. The carbon dioxide is in the air that you exhale, so that is a waste product that's created by this process. And the water molecules technically stay in part of the mitochondria called the matrix. It's like the fluid-filled portion of the mitochondria. So the water basically stays in there, and of course the energy, the ATP, that's used by your cells to complete a whole host of different functions. Things like active transport, all the things that we talked about back in Chapter 7 on cells. Anything that took energy is working off of ATP. Now, to go over some of the main ideas with this process, we'll start with this diagram directly from your book. I like this one because it breaks things down and makes it relatively simple. I mean, remember, just like last chapter, that process of photosynthesis is complicated. So is the process of respiration. So even though there's a little bit of busyness going on in this diagram, it really can't be avoided just because of the nature of the process. Just a couple things to point out with this one is that there are 3 steps to this. The first step is glycolysis, the second step is the Krebs cycle, and then the third step is electron transport chain. Something that's unique about glycolysis is that it occurs in the cytoplasm of the cell. So before, when we were talking about photosynthesis, everything was happening inside of the chloroplast. That's not true for this process. For starters, it's a different organelle. It's now the mitochondrion. Mitochondrion is just singular for mitochondria. So we've already talked about this before, but since we're just dealing with one, technically it's mitochondrion, although I don't get too concerned about that really with this chapter. But the process of glycolysis, the first part of the process of respiration, happens outside of the mitochondrion in the cytoplasm. There's one thing that's used to start this. It needs glucose. That glucose gets broken apart into something called pyruvic acid. You can see with the arrows here, the pyruvic acid goes on to the Krebs cycle. The other important thing that's made as a product of glycolysis that goes somewhere else is the NADH. NADH is very similar to NADPH that we talked about last chapter. This is just another energy carrier. It's going to be used during electron transport chain to eventually make some ATP. So that NADH gets transported over to ETC. The last thing that we get from this process is a little bit of ATP. You'll find out we only get 2 net ATP molecules. We'll talk about that in a little bit more detail when we get into a video later on like each of these individual processes. But for now, just knowing that 2 ATP get created there is fine. As far as the process of the Krebs cycle goes, this accepts the pyruvic acid from glycolysis. Its products are NADH, which is actually one of the same products that was made during glycolysis, and this thing called FADH2, which we've never talked about before. FADH2 is similar to NADH in the fact that it's an energy carrier. It just has a different structure. Because it has a different structure, it's going to behave a little bit differently once it gets to electron transport chain, which again, we're going to talk about each of these processes in more detail in separate videos. So I'll get into that stuff later on. This is just kind of an overview of the process right now. The last part of Krebs cycle is some ATP is created here as well. And then finally, with electron transport chain, the NADH and FADH2, as well as the NADH from glycolysis, end up at ETC, and electron transport chain converts those things into ATP molecules. So most of the ATP is actually made in the last step. There's far more made at electron transport chain than there is at the Krebs cycle and at glycolysis put together. And we'll get into how that actually works a little bit later on. For now, I just want you to know those 3 steps. You should know them in order, and you should know the basic things that are shown on this diagram, like that pyruvic acid is a product of glycolysis, that glycolysis happens in the cytoplasm, all of those kinds of details. I will take a second to talk about each step in a little bit more detail and just give you a few basic things that you should know about each one. So to start things off, I will focus on glycolysis, just to point out some unique factors we talked about here. The first thing is that glycolysis takes place in the cytoplasm. It's unique from the rest of it because everything else is happening inside of the mitochondrion. The next thing is that it produces a few different products at the end. One of the things it produces is pyruvic acid. And you have to know where things go in this process. The pyruvic acid goes to the Krebs cycle. The next thing is NADH. And the NADH, if you remember, goes to electron transport chain, which we'll just abbreviate as ETC. And then the last one is the ATP. There's 2 ATP molecules produced here, and those go to be used in the cell. So those are really the main things that I want you to know about glycolysis for now. Like I said before, we'll eventually go through each of these in a more detailed video, just focusing on that particular step of the process of respiration. But for now, this is plenty to know. As far as the Krebs cycle is concerned, the location for this one is inside of the mitochondrion. You should know that it's a cycle. Hopefully you can pick that up from its name. Oh, there I go with a misspelling. Trying to catch these things now. There we go. Now, as far as the products go, you should know where these things are headed. NADH, just like was produced in glycolysis, that's going to go to electron transport chain. The one that's a little bit new, like I mentioned before, the FADH2, that's also going to go to ETC, although it's going to pick up at a different spot in ETC, which we'll get into later on. And then the ATP that's produced here, same thing. That ends up going to the cell, just like it did for glycolysis. And then the last part is to talk about electron transport chain. Same thing, this one's found in the mitochondrion. The idea with this one is that it accepts the NADH and the FADH2. And then lastly, this produces ATP, produces most of the ATP in this process, which ends up going out into the cell for use for energy. So I know that this was very sort of broad and basic, but what we'll do is we'll go back later on and sort of fill in the details with each of these individual processes. It's very important to know where these things are happening, what they produce, and where their products go. If you know those things for now, that's pretty much what I'm looking for. So as always, thank you for watching, and make sure you answer the questions after this video is over. Thank you.